They take your jobs. Let's say thank you. Vote for SPA. Post-work. High life.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Alpbach. My name is Damita Pressel, and I am delighted and honored to open the Europe in the World Days together with all of you lovely people. Now, if you're anything like me, you might be wondering, what was up with those videos? They are part of an immersive artistic intervention here at the European Forum Alpbach 2024. This takes the shape of an election campaign. You will find posters spread throughout Alpbach, a polling booth, politician rallies, slogans, manifestos, and yes, as you've seen, campaign videos. They present two utopian ideas, and they offer you opportunities for participation. So we invite you to explore and to contribute. Now, of course, rallies, slogans, manifestations, posters, they'll be familiar to many of us in this historic election year. More voters than ever in history have headed or are set to head to the polls this year. And they're having to make some consequential choices and decisions. In January, Taiwan elected a democratic leader, rejecting the influence of China. In June, as EU citizens elected their parliament, we saw liberal forces suffer losses as the right wing made gains. The same will most likely hold true in Austria this September. And now we look to the United States as their citizens cast their ballots in November. And then, of course, there were exercises in propaganda in countries like Iran and Russia, falsely labeled elections by many media outlets and commentators, but fully unworthy of the name. This year is truly a moment of truth for the world and for Europe, which is grappling with its standing in a new world, a complex world, a more dangerous, a more contested world. The theme for this year's forum could not be more pertinent, and to elaborate on it and to help me open our Europe in the World Days, please welcome on stage the President of the European Forum Alpbach, Andreas Streichel.
So, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. What you did not explain is what these two parties stand for. And everybody is here can actually vote until the 27th. So one party is for equality between human and animals. That includes wasps, which is very difficult here. And the other one is for total relaxation, spa. Everything is being done by machines. So let's see. Well, welcome very much. I have the task to introduce all our guests of honor, and I would like to start with Vjosa Osmani, the President of the Republic of Kosovo. She is in Alpbach, but she's not in this room yet. But in the room is the hereditary Prince and Regent of Liechtenstein, Alois von und zu Liechtenstein. Welcome very much. Also, Kristina Gerasimov, the Deputy Prime Minister of the Republic of Moldova. She's also in Alpbach, but also not yet in the room, but will join us later. And then we have a wonderful list of speakers today, and I would like to do that alphabetically. I would like to start with José Manuel Barroso, the former President of the European Union. Welcome. Next is Joschka Fischer, former Vice Chancellor and Federal Minister of Foreign Affairs in Germany. Welcome. Then we have Nipon Mehta, a wonderful social entrepreneur. Hi, Nipon. Then we have James O'Brien, Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs of the US State Department. Welcome, James. We have Yemi Osinbajo, former Vice President of Nigeria and presently Chair of the Climate Action Platform for Africa. We have Svenja Hahn from the European Parliament. Welcome. And last but not least, Maria Vani, a famous writer and a wonderful writer. As some of you maybe know, Pope Francis would have loved to join us here today via video. Unfortunately, he can't, but he insisted that we mention that he wishes us success and that he is responsible for the good weather. He could have adjusted the heat a little bit. But because of the weather, just one point of organization, everybody in this room is invited to join a Be Together right after this event. It starts right outside here and goes through the whole village. Everybody is invited, and please take part of it. So, if we think about Alpbach, we having the 80th Alpbach this year, but we have our 80th birthday next year. And Alpbach was founded at the end of August in 1945. The war in Europe had ended, and the war was about to end in Japan. And it was founded by a group of scientists and resistance fighters who had actually only one goal with this forum: to give the European young generation a perspective of a democratic future, to prevent that all the bloodshed and hate that they had lived through all their life would never ever be repeated. So next year, if everything goes well, we will celebrate 80 years of peace in Western Europe. That's, for European standards, an absolute record time. And we would have been able to celebrate 80 years of peace in all of Europe hadn't it been for the wars in former Yugoslavia, and hadn't it been for the brutal attack of Putin on Ukraine. And if we just think about that and nothing else and leave everything else aside, wouldn't it be time to think about the accession of the remaining European states into the Union as fast as possible, just because of peace? So, 30 years ago, we celebrated the accession of Austria, of Sweden, and of Finland, and we grew the EU to 15 member states. You look back at that time, in the mid-late 90s, we celebrated the starting of opening the borders within the Union. We celebrated Erasmus. We celebrated the fact that we turned Europe into the largest and most successful consumer market in the world. We celebrated a lot in the late 90s. And then came 2004, and we expanded the Union again by 10 members at the same time, from 15 to 25, with Cyprus and Malta, but mainly our friends in Eastern Europe, from the Baltics down to Hungary. And yeah, if I remember those days, in my view, we had a blast. It was just wonderful to be in the European Union. The unification had worked, and we all benefited from it. And then, somewhere around that time, something happened, and the anti-European forces had always been around, But I guess for a pretty long period of time, they were silenced simply by the success of Europe. But with the economic and political success of Europe slowly fading away, they became more powerful, and they claimed everything that went well at that time and still now for the nation states, and everything that went badly for the Union. And then Brexit came. And today, 8 years after Brexit, I think we have to accept the fact that Europe is not a leader anymore, not economically and not politically. We have become, and that's good, nothing against it, the masters of regulation. We have become the masters of big announcements and of mediocre execution. And that brings no joy, that brings no pride, it doesn't create jobs. Is it the nation state's fault? Yes. Is it the EU's fault? Yes. So what do we need to do? And the first thing to solve a problem is to realize that you have a problem. We had brilliant politicians in Europe in the past. We had not so good ones in the past in the EU and in the nation states, and we have the same situation now. But let's take one example, and I apologize for just picking one person. There are many other examples. Think back to Poland 20 years ago, the year 2004, when they joined the European Union. At least where I come from, we thought about very Catholic, very conservative, agriculture, and nastily stolen cars. That was our image of Poland at that period of time. Then Donald Tusk comes along, and within 7 years, he transforms Poland into a brilliant economic region. He turns Poland liberal, open-minded. Poland, throughout the financial crisis from 2008 on, was the most successful European state. Then he leaves his job in 2014, becomes president of the European Council, and then tell me one thing that Donald Tusk stands for, or anything that happened in that period from 14 to 19 that was a breakthrough for Europe. I haven't found one. Now, Donald Tusk is again Prime Minister of Poland, and he rocks the country. We'll see whether he's successful, hopefully. So I would love to see the EU rocking. I would love to see it. And dear guests and dear scholarship holders, it's up to you to make that happen. I want to see great politicians in Europe finding ways on how to rock the EU and its institutions, and I want to have pride coming back and joy for our accomplishments. The former and present president of the European Commission acknowledged the fact that Europe lost out on the internet, on digitization, and on AI, but promised that we will lead the world in the green transition. And Europe is leading the world in the regulation for the green transition. But it's not leading the world in the transformation. And that's not good enough. The president, former president of the European Commission, took a very clear and very strong and powerful position towards supporting Ukraine. And some of the member states took a lot of actions for European standards, very strong actions, but unfortunately not strong enough. And Ukraine's dire situation, the second year of the attack, is proof of it. We live in a brutal world in which success demands long-term, full and decisive commitment of everybody involved. And if we do not have that commitment for those topics that are crucial for the future of Europe, like defending our territory, our environment, our democracy, our rule of law, and our prosperity, then we will fail. We presently live in a world with two superpowers. One is a capitalist country under the control of a dictatorial communist regime. The other one is a capitalist country in which, for many years now, wealth created in the hands of a very few is so gigantic that they can influence politics in an unprecedented manner. Let's hope that the US goes back in the right direction. Let's see which direction India will be taking. Let's see where Africa is going. Let's see where the Middle East is going. Where the connection of the BRIC states that try to create another geopolitical order will bring. But I guess for the next decades, one more geopolitical power that can live a healthy balance between politics and the business world and civil society would be just great for the world and the European Union. It's this balance that secures democracy, the rule of law, the freedom, and human rights. And if we want that kind of Europe, we need a stronger union. We need a defense union to secure our borders, however we define them. But if we define them, we need to defend them without outside help. Does this weaken the sovereignty of the nation states? Yes, but it makes each of them stronger. If the Union wants to lead the world in green tech, does it weaken the nation state's sovereignty? Maybe yes, but it will make them stronger. And there are many, many other unions that we need to finalize. We need the capital markets union, the communications union, we need the transportation union. All topics for which sovereignty is totally unimportant. And they all will make the European countries stronger. So, we shouldn't wait for everything so long as we did for the airline industry. Is Austria or Belgium, are they less sovereign because their airlines are owned by Lufthansa? Do we feel inferior because of that? It took us 50 years to realize it really doesn't matter. Let's be a bit faster with everything else. We have to make a choice. One part of the European spectrum of political parties has made its choice, the nationalistic parties. They clearly stand for less Europe instead of more Europe. With this position, the nationalistic parties in Europe make it very clear to everybody that they are not a bit interested in Europe being a partner in shaping the future of the world. With this position, they make it very clear that they're not interested in Europe being sovereign. In terms of defense, as a consequence of that, we will either remain at the mercy of the US, or we all turn into Hungary and try to play cozy with the Russians and the Chinese at the same time. Nationalistic parties fully neglect the fact that politics, the world's economy, and the business world have taken a dramatic shift in a sense, whether that's good or not, that size matters like never, ever before. If Europe wants to compete and wants to be able to compete with the US and China, we need champions. We need champions in green tech, and we need champions in other industries. And we should demonstrate to the world that you can be very successful without longing for military supremacy by just being able to protect your sovereignty. Nationalists don't care about that. Nationalists do not care about that, but the liberals, the Christian and Social Democrats, and the Greens just don't act decisive enough and fast enough. So getting in action, this is what Alpbach is here for. This is the moment of truth, and it will come back. It will stay with us, that moment of truth. Here in Alpbach, We have great minds from science, from politics, from business, from civil society and the arts. And we have the best and most diverse group of the young generation I could imagine ever. And they're all willing to fight for a better Europe. So together we can help to create a Europe that knows exactly what it wants and knows exactly how to get there. A Europe full of pride, joy, and happiness.
Thank you so much, Andreas Streichel. Ladies and gentlemen, we have two different panels prepared for you today. On the first, we'll be taking a look at Europe from the outside, from the perspective of our allies. And on our second, we'll be looking at the role of the European Union in the world more from the inside out. Now, I've been told that last year, apparently, people didn't realize there were two panels and started leaving after the first. I would kindly ask you to avoid that this year. So again, I repeat, we have two panels. You, unfortunately, will not have the opportunity to ask questions in person, but you will have the opportunity to ask all the more questions online. So there is a QR code right here. And when you scan it, it will take you to a website with a very simple interface. You put in your question, you post it, and it shows up on this tablet here that I will be checking, and that means I will be able to forward your questions to our speakers. And you'll also be able to upvote and downvote other people's questions. I encourage you to do that because that makes it easier for me to decide. Usually I can't pass along all the questions, so if there's loads of upvotes on one of them, it makes it very easy for me to decide to ask that one and pass that one along. With that said, let us begin by looking at the outside perspective and looking at Europe from the lens of our allies. And to do so, I'm excited to welcome three wonderful speakers on the panel. The first one is United States Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, James O'Brien. Next, we have the former Vice President of Nigeria from 2015 to 2023, Professor Yemi Osinbajo. And finally, joining me on stage from the Forum Alpbach Network Committee is the Argentine-Spanish writer and communications specialist, Marina Vanni. First of all, thank you so much for joining us. It's wonderful to have you all here. Ambassador O'Brien, if I may start with you and your opening remarks, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Andreas, for very stimulating and focused remarks. I have to say, moment of truth is a really intimidating slogan. It suggests there's just one time, and we know what the right thing is, and the question is, can we do it, and how will we judge ourselves later? For me, I think this is more, in the work I do, about opportunities to use our judgment. And each time we make a choice, we frame issues a certain way, and then we're choosing what next moments of judgment are going to face us. So I'll try here in just a few minutes to frame a few of the topics that affect how the US and Europe work together, and hopefully that will carry us through the panel. I'll just start with the simple point that we are one another's strongest partners. Together, we're close to 1 billion people, depending on where we choose to draw the lines. We are wealthy, creative. We are able to help shape the industries and opportunities of the future in a really important way. And we're one another's largest trading and investment partners. We have a desire to engage with the rest of the world on what I hope ends up being a fair and equitable line. And we share values, which are rooted in the institutions that have been created over the last 75 to 80 years, including this one. what do we choose to use that solidarity for, along with our allies in the Indo-Pacific, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and others? What do we want to do with that? So right now, we face an enormous security challenge. For the first time, there's an openly revisionist power that is willing to violate international law to claim a sphere of influence around its borders. So we need Ukraine to win. We need Russia to understand that this imperial behavior is no longer acceptable. That's both a task for the next year or two in Ukraine. I was just with President Zelensky last week for several hours. I think we have a plan and a way forward, but it's one that only works with the US and Europe work together. The US has contributed just short of $100 billion to Ukraine's defense and the humanitarian situation. Our European partners have contributed $140 billion. This is truly a shared effort. And with that work, we need to make sure that Europe will be secure on an ongoing basis. That involves a response to Russia as we look forward. Another challenge is to consolidate Europe. Andreas mentioned the challenge of enlargement, of engagement in the single market. We see, and my world ends at the shores of the Caspian right now in my current job, but from Central Asia all the way through the Adriatic, a line of states that are hungry to be more engaged with Europe. There's not a single one that says they want more of Russia. Armenia has just asked Russian troops to leave. Azerbaijan is doing a dance to try to keep Russia from being the overweening big brother, all the way across to the Western Balkans, where we see Serbia helping to equip Ukraine. We see Kosovo making decisions about its way forward into its rightful place fully in the international and European markets. We have the opportunity to see Albania and Montenegro move forward very quickly on their European path in the next year. This consolidation is incredibly important from a geopolitical standpoint. The final thing is to talk about the future. We think that most productivity growth, but in fact most of the things relevant to how we lead our lives, will be determined by changes in certain industries. In the green transition that Andreas mentioned, biomedical advances, and artificial intelligence and the range of those issues. If we together decide how those industries will develop, we'll decide whether the benefits flow to just a few or to society. We'll decide whether they can be misused to divide us and drive us further apart, or to consolidate power in either avaricious or aggressive regimes. We can do that together, but we have to continue the work that began in the last 3 years to do that. And that will be one of the challenges. That's then how we engage the rest of the world, particularly China, right? As a no longer quite growing, but an emerging global power, it's important that we stand together. And China had thought it could divide us. That no longer seems to be true. But we also need to deal with the rest of the world in an effective way. I sincerely hope, as the Vice President said this week, that we will see an end to the violence in Gaza soon. The negotiators are finally meeting today to look at an approach. But then we also have to look at the generational sorts of issues about climate change and other issues that we will have to deal with, and we will deal with it better together. Now, I did want to say just a minute. This says I have 34 minutes. That can't be right.
It goes backwards.
Okay. So I'll just say a minute or two, because
It started at 40.
Andreas announced that we have an election, and so I'm trying to process that news. But I'm legally prohibited from saying anything of a partisan nature. It's one of the rules of our system. But I do want to note a couple of things. The most important thing is that responsible governments solve problems together so that our people see that responsible politics is possible and they don't resort to simple answers as are often provided by the nationalists. And I will say the kind of politics I'm seeing emerge in my country now, for the first time in years, reflects the country I think I live in. It's one that's hopeful, that's growing, that's accepting, that realizes a lot of what people do is their own business and not the business of the state. And it's a real change, and I hope that gets captured in the way Europe thinks about the United States. On a professional sense, I'll just make two very quick points. We do have some uncertainty about the outcome. The people get to decide. So in that period of uncertainty over the next couple of months, it is a set of opportunities for us to use our judgment. What do we think will happen? How do we protect against what we think will be the worst thing that might happen to us? And including by, say, having Europe invest much more in defense and in support for Ukraine while we worry about what may happen in changes in the US. The second is an opportunity for some confidence. Our country has historically had an isolationist wing. We have always stood strong with our European friends at the end of the day, and I'm confident that will happen. But in the meantime, I think we have a unique opportunity to work together, because for the next 5 months, President Biden, who I think has been a great president and has stood strong for the values of the last 80 years, is going to be cementing his legacy and the values and the institutions that he helped shape throughout his career. So we have a president who will take chances to deliver results over the next months so that the next president doesn't have to face the crises that beset us now. And that is a huge opportunity for Europe to respond to. And that's part of my daily job, is to find ways that we can advance on each of the issues that concern us. Sorry, over to you.
Thank you so much. There's no need to apologize or to worry about the timer. I promise to look at you with an evil eye if we do run the risk of.
I'm just worried about the judgment of everyone here, because it's a beautiful place and a gorgeous day, and they've all decided to be in a dark room.
I think they have good reason. Thank you, Ambassador. Professor Ojenbajo, would you like to go next with the opening remarks?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to Alpbach for the great honor of being here today. Let me say that for very many years it appeared the right thing to say is that the world is interdependent, interconnected, and we need to function as one. And that seemed just to be the right thing to say, but it appears in the last decade at least, that it's becoming more obvious that it is the sensible thing, as opposed to just being right. It absolutely is a sensible thing, and everything points in that direction. Starting, for instance, with what we found with COVID, for example. I mean, that was clearly, showed us that the world is interconnected in a real way. I mean, from one country, in a matter of months, the entire world was consumed by a pandemic. And it was evident, even at that time, that the structures for global intervention, even in a crisis of that dimension, just wasn't in place or wasn't strong enough. And we in Africa, and I imagine in many parts of the global south, experienced the delays in getting vaccines on account of vaccine nationalism and all that. But I think that now it's evident again that one day, and it may not necessarily be soon, there may be another pandemic. So the question is, in what ways are we ready for the kind of intervention that will make sense for the entire world? Because everything overnight, everything will be cheaper, life will be easier, and all of that. And these politicians are just a pack of thieves. If we kick them out, we can get everything right. And somehow that simple rhetoric gains traction. So I think there's a need to tackle the problems again as a global concern in the Sahel. Of course, the EU is actively involved in one shape or form, especially with the security issues. But then there is now the incursion, as you know, of Russia of China, and to a certain extent Turkey, who are able to provide arms and ammunition. So geopolitics is playing a role in keeping the Sahel in the completely unstable state that it is, and encouraging all of the negative outcomes that I've described. So I think that these are some of the issues. Of course, there are a whole variety of others that we need to think about globally. There's no question in my mind that a shared vision, finding common ground, looking for ways of working together is really the way by which all of us can have, decent lives and livelihoods. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for adding in that perspective from Africa. Let's move over to Latin America and to Marina Vanni.
Thank you. So as part of the Forum Alpbach Network Committee, as a representative for the youth in the stage, and also as a voice from the Global South, I want to speak about the disconnect that there seems to be in Europe with what's happening in the Global South. Because usually the Global South is seen as the rest of the world when we're actually talking about the majority of the world. Because if we include China as well, we're talking about 88% of the population. And I want to talk a bit about the interdependencies that exist between what's happening in Europe and in the West and what happens in the Global South. So for that, let me give a brief example based on recent events. Maybe some of you have heard about the elections in Venezuela. There has been a clear situation of electoral fraud. The EU has not recognized the election results. The US has recognized Edmundo González as the winner of the elections, but not as president-elect, as they have done with Juan Guaidó in the past. And this situation, Josep Borrell has warned that a serious crisis could follow if Nicolás Maduro, the re-elected president, did not recognize the genuine results of the election. And there is a connection between this aspect and the US campaign, because if we think about the Venezuelan crisis, we're talking about 7.7 million people who have been displaced from their country. That's about 1/4 of the population. And many of them are traveling through extremely dangerous routes to head to the southern border in the US. And with migration being such an important topic for the US campaign, and 2023 was a record year for encounters in the southern border, Venezuelans being one of the groups that stand out in these situations, you can see how an event that is seemingly irrelevant to the West has direct political consequences, for example, in the US campaign. And with that, I want to talk also a bit about how, all of these events are not happening in the backyard of the world, but in the front yard of the world, I would say. While Europe looks away to some extent, we have mentioned the BRICS before. The BRICS have expanded this year, so now you have Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates. And this means that the BRICS Plus comprise around 37% of the world's GDP, which is half as much as Europe. So then if we still think about the Global South as a minor entity, well, we are wrong in that perspective. Europe depends on the Global South in so many ways. One of them has to do also with the green transition, because Europe needs critical minerals, for example, the lithium that can be found in the lithium triangle in Argentina, Bolivia, Chile. Also, Europe needs workers urgently. Europe needs migrants because of demographic change, because of the shrinking workforce, because of the aging population. It is the Chamber of Industry and Commerce in Germany in 2023 reported that more than 1 in every 2 companies had trouble filling vacancies. So the biggest economy in Europe is struggling to find the workers they need, and yet migration is a controversial or a problematic topic instead of an opportunity to have Europe grow. So this is really, and as a migrant myself, now I live in Germany, I can see the barriers that migrants face, and we're talking about bureaucracy, about rules like Andreas said before, about discrimination, about lack of proper integration, which is not the same as assimilation and erasure of cultures, but really embracing the people that are coming. And this gets me to the point that Europe also needs to deal with its colonial past. And I'm not just talking about, returning looted art to African countries and, return the Benin bronzes to the rightful owners, but I'm talking about really recognizing the consequences of what has been done and understanding that Europe is rich now and richer now because of that colonial past and that systemic inequality, which is obviously also seen in the climate crisis, with the global south facing the worst of the consequences, even though they generate less CO2 emissions. So I think that with this brief overview, I hope that you get a glimpse of the interdependencies that exist between the global south and Europe, and how events such as the deterioration of democracy in some countries, Venezuela, but could be any other country, have direct consequences, not just at the local level, but in the global stage. And I really hope that in stages like this, in spaces like this, that we can have more global South voices to discuss these topics. And I hope that Europe really realizes that if they don't pay attention to what's happening in the rest of the world, which is the majority of the world, those issues are going to come knocking at the door. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those very strong words, Marina. I was supposed to ask you my questions, but given the time and given the number of questions that have come in, I'm going to skip straight ahead to yours. And one that keeps coming up in various ways and with different wordings is, Mr. Ambassador, one that is directed at you, which is what happens to Ukraine after the elections in November in case the isolationist forces that you referred to win?
So I mentioned I've just spent a lot of time in Kyiv. I think there are a couple things. One is historically the U.S. has done the right thing, whatever the voices are. I give, in 1953, the U.S. Senate was led by people who had campaigned in their individual states, but on a program to remove the United States from NATO. And this was at the peak of the Cold War. In 1941, the U.S. Congress had put in place a law that would have required that the U.S. reduce its military by more than 2/3. 1941. So clearly, there was a prominent voice, and a very popular president at the time worked hard to get that law overturned and failed. And it really came down finally by one vote in the House of Representatives that the U.S. was able to continue with the Lend-Lease programs that allowed the Soviet Union to begin fighting back, that kept Britain in the fight, and that changed the course of that war. So this is a part of our history. But traditionally, we end up doing the right thing. So I have confidence in that. I have more confidence if we use the next months to put Ukraine in a position to do well. And I think with the offensive into Kursk, we see that Ukraine is able to say to President Putin, we can continue this war for as long as you want to. It will not go the way that you want it to. And then the alternative is to find some way out of the war. This will be Putin's decision, and if anyone can think of what it is that will make him say enough is enough, I'll look forward to that. Maybe our next panel can answer that question. But so I guess I have confidence that if we use the intervening time well enough to present Ukraine as a consolidated success story, then the next president, regardless of preferences, will say, this is a thing I don't want to uproot. This is something I want to work on the basis of. And I think that leaves us in a very strong position. So again, it's the choice we make now that will shape what actually happens, regardless of the political slogans.
Professor Oceanbajo, what I'm seeing here for the most part, again, several questions all worded differently, but all with the same intent, which is what can we do to help? So what can the European Union, European countries do to support African countries in your fight against climate change, the climate crisis, in your efforts to mitigate this crisis?
I think the first approach is not to think of it in terms of help, as opposed to thinking of it in terms of how to solve a problem in a global way. Because what we're talking about really is, so we have proposed, African countries have proposed climate positive growth, which means, just as an example, and this isn't necessarily, the very best one. So today, bauxite is processed to aluminum outside of Africa, but Africa has 25% of bauxite. Now, if we process the bauxite in Africa using renewable energy, we will save the world on an annual basis 1% of global emissions. Now, it makes sense to support whatever effort there is. It makes sense to support to invest, and also, access to markets and all that. And this is all quite a bit, but I just want to summarize it. It makes sense to support those kinds of efforts. It makes sense, for instance, to support green data, data centers, green data centers all over in Africa. Data centers, for example, don't require any particular location, but they require a lot of power. Right? And there are many countries of the world that will say, well, we're not too happy with what happens with water, what happens with this and that. But if you locate data centers in Africa where you have renewable energy, where you have plenty of solar, and of course more irradiation than practically anywhere else, obviously that makes sense. So there is a sense in which just doing, investing right, investing logically, and there is, commercial sense in it, we can actually turn the narrative, we can actually change things. So for me, I think the important thing is, how do we reduce the cost of capital? Because there are so many issues. How do we do, what sort of blended finance would be required for those kinds of investments? How do we ensure that we're able to have access to markets, for green products and all of that? In other words, how can we truly, develop a green industrial civilization from a place where it just makes sense? Because you're starting from a relatively low base. You're going to have very few legacy assets to worry about, very few stranded assets to worry about. So I think that it just makes sense for us to think in those terms, and that is the sort of global cooperation that I think we need.
Thank you for those very specific points as well. Marina, maybe I'd like to pass those points on to you, because you mentioned the Global South often feels treated like, a less important little brother by Europe and the West. And in fact, these were very concrete measures that Professor Osunbajo measured that China, for example, is taking, or even Russia is taking. So these investments in the countries of the Global South, they're very practical, very concrete measures that is causing many of those countries to turn more towards China and turn more towards leaders other than Europe. What can we do to reverse this, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that could be tackled from many different fronts. Obviously, first front I would mention is what I was mentioning before about really giving a voice to the Global South on the global stage. I think maybe one good example of that would be the African Union having a seat at the G20. So really understanding that these voices are important and these voices need to be part of the conversation. Then in terms of agreements, I would think that's also very important because, as Andreas Reichel said, Europe is the master of regulation, but execution is relatively poor, we could say. And I think one good example of that is, for example, the EU-Mercosur agreement. So, for example, I'm from Argentina, a Mercosur country. Negotiations have been ongoing for 20 years, and now there's a sort of draft agreement, but everything's in standby. So then it's no surprise that suddenly Brazil says they're interested in being part of the Belt and Road Initiative, or that Uruguay, Argentina are strengthening their ties with China, because of course every other country is going to look for partnerships somewhere else. And I think that's also something that was mentioned here in this panel about health and the importance of cooperating in health to also strengthen these relationships, because we also saw that with the pandemic and the vaccines. If we look again at the Latin American example, you would see that China and Russia would provided most of the vaccines at the beginning of the pandemic, and so then you know who's your ally in that situation. And then obviously climate cooperation is extremely important to have obviously a stronger relationship between Europe and the global South, not only because of these interdependencies that I was mentioning, but also because there's a lot of partnerships and know-how that is shared, and different schemes that are implemented to kind of share that knowledge with global South countries. But I feel like the key issue is a bit deeper than that, because if the West keeps treating the global South as a dumpster, then even if you do all of the programs and cooperation in the world, then the result is not going to be worth it. And then you're going to have like this viral image that we saw a couple of weeks ago of a giant mountain of fast fashion clothes in Chile that you could see from space. And then who do you expect Chile to be allied with if the West does that? So I think there's a lot to unpack on this front, but I think the first start is to really have an honest conversation with all stakeholders and all countries involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's all good and well to talk about liberalism, democracy, and these things, but oftentimes it's this very concrete support that is needed. I have another very highly ranked question here that I'd like to share, because I think it's an interesting one, and you can feel free to chime in. It's not directed at any specific speaker. Our security, the sustainability transition, and the digital revolution depend on a raw material transition, away from fossil fuels to minerals and metals. Yet, we are hugely dependent of certain countries that weaponize this dependence: rare earths, magnesium, graphite, antimony. What solutions would you propose to overcome this, and how do you see the material dimension of the geopolitical challenge ahead?
It's a small question.
Shouldn't take you long.
Well, let me say first that the critical minerals and rare earth metals challenge is a huge one. And for me, I think that there is a need to look at how to diversify supply chains. So today, there's obviously China has a major advantage, and it's evident that we have to be careful to ensure that there is diversification of the supply chains, such that no single region or country has the kind of overarching control over the supply chains. And I think that that's happening already in parts, but we need to, for those of us from the global South, and in particular Africa, we think that it's important that we are integrated into that supply chain in a proper, in a proper way, because a huge percentage of critical minerals is coming from Africa. And we think that not just for purposes of a just process, but more a commercial perspective, that there's a need to properly integrate African countries. Some of what that will involve is new bilateral agreements that would strengthen the integration of the supply chains. I think that we cannot run away, especially because now we know that the only sensible thing is to process critical minerals using renewable energy, right? There's really no other way of doing that. Now, obviously, there are questions and problems around how much fossil fuels we still will use, right? And many of the countries, sad to say, who say ban fossil fuels are still using fossil fuels, and in their multi-decade programs are still planning to use fossil fuels. So we have to make up our minds, really, what do we want to do about fossil fuels, and how much of this do we really want to do? For instance, we in African countries that have fossil fuels have been told you're not going to get public investments anymore. So you've got to go and find your own sources of investments in oil and gas. We say that gas should be a transition fuel and all that. But that argument, is still going back and forth. But we need to be truthful. We need to be, there's a great deal of hypocrisy, I'm afraid to say, around these questions. But we need to have proper conversations around these questions so that we determine exactly what it is that we're going to do. But frankly, I think the renewable energy is the way, that we have to go. Otherwise, we'll reverse practically everything that we've achieved or we will achieve in the coming years. So those are just some of my thoughts on it.
Thank you. Ambassador Bryan, I believe you had a remark.
Yeah, I want to thank both my fellow panelists for focusing on these issues. And I just say on this one, I think it's to be mindful of the products we use and to really push our politicians to follow a few policies. One of them is to diversify supplies. A few years ago, many of the critical minerals, particularly ones needed for electric vehicles, were 95% located in China and Afghanistan, where the concession was owned by China. And now there are many more places around the world. But I think as well, we talk about nearshoring and friendshoring, and I think it echoes in many of the themes that have been mentioned here. One of them is pay attention to how the products you buy get used. It may be a Chinese company that, I don't know who made the mountain of fast fashion, but the part of the issue with Chinese electric vehicles is when they go get bauxite from West Africa, or when they're pursuing cobalt in the Congo, or lithium in Serbia, their offer is, we'll take it. Serbia's 92% of its trade with China is just raw copper ore that goes. The industries are all located in China, or the workers come from China. So there's not the kind of local investment. And if we buy those products, it's cheaper. Often they're good products. But what we are doing is contributing to a new wave of economic colonialism. And I think that's something we have to avoid. And that's the final point. We talk sometimes about friendshoring, and what that means is maybe the US and Europe work together to have unified supply chains. But it has to be broader than that. When we're working on lithium from Chile or other issues, those people have to be involved as partners. And that's not something that is about the global majority as a bloc. Right? A lot of Russian diplomacy is about saying because you're in the global majority, you should be against the dominant powers. But we have to respect the differences in that area and build very strong partnerships where we can, in the hope that that creates more opportunity elsewhere. So all of that requires a lot of activism from us as consumers, as people pushing our politicians to do the right thing, and in the way that we execute it, so that you end up with new, not only economic value chains, but political relationships that mirror kind of what's happened with the EU, where the critical minerals became the basis of a shared resource and a joint political project. And I think that's the way we break down the pathologies that typify a lot of the global relationship to the majority of populations.
Thank you so much. Marina, did you have an input on this question since it was asked to everyone? All right, I think since we started late, we might have time for one more question. Again, to you, Ambassador O'Brien. I'm summing up a few questions here again, but can you briefly speak to what you think are the top priorities for the transatlantic cooperation between Europe and the US, specifically when it comes to defense?
So I mentioned the sort of broad priorities, which is to provide security at home and to engage much more with the rest of the world on the challenges that are coming at us. And that also, though, includes, and sorry I used the phrase rest of the world, but okay. It's also along consolidating Europe. In the defense space, the first thing is make more. I mean, one of the things that is stunning about this war with Ukraine, nobody was prepared for a war of this kind. And we just weren't making enough of the things that protect citizens. Patriot systems takes years to build. Missiles apparently are cheap and easy to build. Countering drones or building drones that can serve defensively as well as on attacks. And then all the way back to gunpowder and things like that. So we have to do that. The second thing is control supply chains. Russia is able to use older and older technology to continue pulverizing Ukrainian cities. And we need to find some way in which our businesses don't find the pursuit of an extra market for certain things to be worth allowing that kind of violence to continue. That's a place where, much as we don't want to talk about the future of regulation, it is a change in the incentives by which businesses engage. And I think then the third thing is to recognize where the real risk and harm to human life happen. And I know my job right now, I'm focused on US-European relations and on the conflicts that are happening within Europe. We know that the conflicts that are happening in Sudan, in the Horn of Africa, across the Sahel, these are in the Congo, these have destroyed millions of lives and a countless, an innumerable amount of economic opportunity and human opportunity for people across the world. And we have to find some way of addressing those. So in the practical cooperation, it just begins with making more of the things that we need to keep ourselves safe, having some control over who gets control of that, but then making sure that it's used to extend a zone of stability that allows for more peace and opportunity for people around the globe.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thank you so much to all of the speakers for sharing their thoughts. Thank you so much. Now, as I've announced, we do have a second panel. But before that, for a brief impulse, our next speaker is the founder of Service Space, an incubator platform for social projects with an incredible 500,000 volunteers worldwide. Please help me welcome on stage Nipun Mehta.
So I think I'm supposed to be the commercial break in the political sort of storyline. I've been eyeing this water the whole time I've been sitting down. Thank you for being here and for standing for a lot of the shared values. I saw the Rhizome network artwork outside, and that's really what I want to talk about, although I hadn't planned that. But before I get into it, I want to start with a story. Many years ago, I was at a retreat in India, and during the lunchtime, the instructions were go sit with somebody that you don't know. And so I sat down on a table with a teenage boy a young man from a village that I didn't know, was a stranger to me. And we sat down, and before we started the meal, I have a practice of just doing a moment of silence in gratitude for the food I received. So I closed my eyes, and I opened my eyes to kind of a shocking thing in front of me. I saw that young man put his hands in my plate to take a bite, and this is Indian food, right? So you have like roti, which is bread and vegetables, and you dip it in the dal. And he was doing all of that in my plate. Had never happened to me before, and I was like, I wasn't sure what to make of it. Then he does something even more bewildering. He goes on to feed me that bite. And outside of my mom, when I was growing up, nobody has ever done that to me. And I don't think nobody since has done that, right? So I was like, I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to be kind and generous, and so I received the bite. But I must have looked very confused. And so to help me process my confusion, he says to me that the way I grew up, if you want to make a connection, if you want to build a relationship with something that you value, serve. Make an offering. I saw you pray, and I wanted to be a part of your prayer, and I thought, what better way than to make an offering? I was blown away. I was like, who is this kid? So we start eating now normally from our plates. But as we were eating, I was like, well, so what do you do? I mean, I knew he was a teenager, but I was just very curious because he was way wiser than his years. And he goes on to blow me away one more time. He says, whenever people ask me, what do you do? I tell them this story of a sparrow. He says the sparrow was hanging out and one fine day gets the word that the sky is falling, that the world is in bad shape, and we need to do something. And the sparrow looks at that and says, but I'm just a sparrow, what could I do? Reflects a little bit, must be going into that little meditative silence, and then turns around and puts its feet up towards the sky. And so somebody looks at the sparrow and says, hey, little sparrow, what are you doing? And the sparrow says, I'm doing my little bit to lift up the sky. And I heard that, and it moved me so deeply because what the sparrow was teaching us is that you have to have a balance between the known, the unknown, and the unknowable. The known is easy to understand. We get that, right? That's usually in the field of the hands of action. But that by itself is never enough. The unknown is a little bit scarier because you sort of have to process what you don't know. But it's not that scary because I didn't know how to ride a bike, but I learned it. So you have faith in your capacity to learn. And that's the unknown sort of lives in the realm of our heads. But the unknowable is what happens in the space in between us, is the emergence that is where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. It's like water. I'll use this moment. If you look at water, if you're hydrogen atoms and I'm an oxygen atom, neither one of us is liquid. Neither one of us has a nourishing capacity. But if we come together in a certain way, new properties emerge. And to hold that emergence, to hold that unknowable, is a matter of the heart. So how do we balance the hands, head, and the heart? But the sparrow actually teaches us that you don't just balance it in equal proportions, you lead with the heart. And if you do, your hands and your head create very different designs. Gandhi had this beautiful quote. He says, men want systems to be so good that they don't have to be. What he's really warning against is he's saying that we want to say that, systems are a product of our head. So we want to move the burden of peaceful coexistence from our heart to our heads. That's very convenient. But we can do better. We can actually design for the heart. In the world of social change that I inhabit, we always tend to think critical mass. We want to respond to suffering. But if only millions of people get behind what I'm talking about, then wow, we could really change the world, right? But a really inspiring turn of phrase I heard was from John Paul Lederbach. He's a renowned peace builder. He was once in Sudan, And everyone was saying, yeah, we just need this. We just need more numbers. We need more people convinced of my way. And he turns to them and he says, you know, the missing ingredient is not critical mass. The missing ingredient is critical yeast. Now, for those of you that don't know yeast, my friend Severin says, you know, just say Hefe. That's the German word for yeast. So when you bake bread, anyone who has done that will tell you that you have flour, you have salt, you have sugar, and you have water. But you also have yeast. And the thing about the yeast is it creates the platform on which everything exponentially rises. And so if we don't have the yeast of the heart, we will actually never be able to create the kind of bread that nourishes all. And so how do we start to think? How do we find the place where critical mass meets critical yeast? Where the flour might be the critical mass, which is still needed, but if it wasn't for the yeast, if it isn't, the question really goes from how many and accumulating the power and quantity to quality, to who, to the right people in the right context that allows for this kind of regenerative platform for exponential growth to happen that goes beyond the numbers. So that, I think, is the possibility. And that's what the sparrow teaches us. The little sparrow is saying, I'm going to do just a small little act, and you can dismiss it and say, wow, well, what impact is that going to have on the world? That's just cute. That's naive. That's not significant. But the reason why it's significant is because it activates. It is the yeast of the heart that activates the whole platform of consciousness that allows for 1,000 flowers to bloom. The sparrow knows that it is not doing something that is a drop in the ocean, but it actually is looking for the ocean in the entire drop, in that one drop. And I think that's the possibility. And what I see here in Alpbach is actually an experiment in that direction, to be the critical yeast. That is the rhizome network. We have so many metaphors in nature, and here we are trying to do that social permaculture here, trying not just to be that yeast, but also to lead with the heart, to create that yeast of the heart. And I think if we do that, we will surprise ourselves. And so I just want to say thank you for doing those small acts of love and of kindness, which make a huge difference and activate the web of consciousness. Thank you so much. I forgot to give you one announcement. So to practice this, this is a completely spontaneous idea that came up yesterday in conversation. I have these little heart pins. I don't think we have enough for everybody, but as you go to the exit, you'll see them. But the beauty of this heart pin, it's a pin you can put on. It's made by women who live in the slums in a community that I work with. And at one point, they gave me a bunch of these heart pins because they wanted to give something. It was their act of being a sparrow. They made it at that point from waste cloth even. And when they gave it to me, I was so touched, and I put it on, and they gave me a bunch, and they said, we know you like to give it, so you can just give it away. And then somebody looked at my heart pin and said, oh, that's a beautiful heart pin. And I gave it to them. And that was so meaningful that I realized that this is actually a deep lesson, that this is not from me to you. This is actually from people you don't know to me, to you. And if you put this on and somebody says, nice heart pin, you pay it forward. That we are ultimately all just keepers and stewards of this incredible web of consciousness, of love that binds us together as humans. So please take one as you go, and thank you for spreading love.
Well, I know you joked that you were the commercial break, but I have never seen a commercial break this inspiring, so thank you. Thank you. So before, as I was checking your questions, one of you wrote, "Why are there no European speakers on the panel?" And that was not some malevolent act on our part. It was because the first panel concerned the view of our allies. And we are now, you'll be happy to know, I hope, moving on to a panel with more European speakers on it, to take a look at the European Union more from the inside. And I'm very excited to welcome again 3 outstanding speakers to the stage. The former president of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso. German member of the European Parliament of the Free Democratic Party in Germany, Svenja Hahn. As well as the former Vice Chancellor and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany, Joschka Fischer. Thank you so much for joining us all on stage this afternoon. You've seen a panel already, so you know how it goes. Mr. Barroso, if I may start with you and if I may ask for your opening remarks on the topic.
First of all, thank you very much for the kind invitation to be here. It's my second time at the Alpbach Forum. Last time I was leading the Commission. Now I'm not in any official position. So since I left politics, one thing I can say is that my sincerity is growing day by day. What I'm going to give you is my opinion. It may be false, it may be biased. I continue to be a very committed European, but at least it's my opinion in full independence. I know it's very easy to be cynical about the European Union. It's very easy. In this kind of gatherings, it's very difficult to criticize one country because the ambassador will react immediately. If you say bad things about China or Russia or the United States or India or any of our countries. But the European Union is kind of a whipping boy. We can always put the blame on the European Union. And I believe this is part, in fact, of our problem. Because during the 10 years I was leading the European Commission, and many more in the European institutions, because I was 12 years in my government, in my country, and so member of the European Council. At that time, the foreign ministers were members of the European Council in 92, 95, and also in other. I remember that at that time it was extremely easy for the politicians, and it's still today, to do what I call the Europeanization of failure and nationalization of success. When things go well, it's the merit of the national countries. When things go bad, it's the fault of Brussels. I'm no longer here defending of the European Commission, not at all. But I want to put things in perspective. And maybe the best is to share with you some of my experience. 2012, in the Berlaymont, Monde, headquarters of the Commission, I invited the chief economists of the most important banks operating in Europe for a brainstorm. And I asked them, how many of you believe that Greece is going to remain in the euro? And how many of you believe that the euro will survive? All of them except one said, Mr. President, by the end of the year, Greece will be out of the euro. It's impossible. As soon as possible, put them out. It's a real problem for the euro. And half of them said the euro will not survive. But in fact, the euro survived. Greece is a member of the euro. And in fact, today, the euro is the second global currency of reserve. And so it shows that those chief economists, extremely brilliant, very well-paid people, they were wrong. Why? Because they underestimated the political factor. So my point is, and I'm saying it today with all independence, the resilience of the European Union is higher than most people assume. The same afterwards, when we had the pandemic, in fact, the European Union has almost no competence in terms of public health. We don't have a European health service, we have national health services. But it was possible for the 27 governments to agree to ask the European Commission to buy vaccines on their behalf. And generally speaking, the European Union has done well in terms of response to the pandemic. And in fact, it was as a response to the pandemic that the European Union has done what during the financial crisis it was not possible to do, in spite of many appeals like mine at that time and others, asking for Eurobonds, asking for some form of mutualization. That was not possible. It was when my good friend Angela Merkel said, only over my dead body there will be Eurobonds. And I said, look, Angela, we wish you a long life. But sooner or later, there will be some kind of debt mutualization because it is impossible to have a common currency without instruments of mutualization. And in fact, after that, now, during the pandemic, Germany, together with others, was able to do it. So what was not possible before became possible afterwards. And I could go on and on, including the issue of Ukraine. In spite of resistance of some, the reality is that so far, the European Union, as Ambassador O'Brien very well said, the European Union and Europeans have been doing great in support to Ukraine. I mean, it would be unthinkable. Not only, of course, Finland and Sweden joining NATO, but Denmark, in a referendum, deciding to join the European identity, security and defense, and now European Union financing, supporting the war against Russia, the resistance of Ukraine against Russia, in spite of some difficulties in some countries. So my point is the following. As one of our founding fathers, for me the great genius of European integration, Jean Monnet, once said, the European community is going to be done through crisis and as successive responses to successive crises. Unfortunately, and it's by the very nature of the European Union, we are not a country. We are today 27 countries. So we are not United States, we are not China, not Russia, or Brazil, or Japan, or we are a kind of a group of countries with limited sharing of sovereignty in some areas. By definition, we are incremental. We are slow. We are more reactive than proactive. But that's somehow the price we have to pay if we want to keep also independent countries. And I do not believe in Europe, most of our citizens, and we are democracies, and that's a very important thing, to be democracies. I do not accept to put at the same level when we speak the United States and China, because China is a totalitarian state, and the United States, in our friend and ally, is a democracy, so it's not the same kind of thing. The reality is, in democracies, we take time. It takes time. And if in one country like the United States, that today is so polarized, with their very difficult system of federal government, I mean, can you imagine now multiply that by 27 countries as we have today in Europe? Of course, by definition, we are slow, fragmented, incremental. And this is a problem we have now. But at the end of the day, I believe we will be able to respond to this crisis. Having said that, I wanted to say that because I saw in some considerations some kind of pessimism, and I know that it's intellectually more glamorous to be pessimistic than to be optimistic or confident, but I want to tell you that I am confident that in face of crisis, the European Union will be able to react. Having said that, I recognize the problems. For me, the biggest problem today, we have two problems, and these are the problems that the European Union now in the next cycle has to address really, and the new Commission and the new leaders. The economy and defense. And that's the point. Of course, there is overall the global challenge of climate change, but that's not a specific issue of the European Union. It's a global issue. But for us, Europe, we have to grow more. We don't have the growth mindset of the United States. We are behind the Americans and the Chinese in some matters of growth, including on scientific and technological matters. And we cannot do that. We have to do much more on that. But that's why, with my good friend Ursula von der Leyen, in the last times of her mandate, the first mandate, decided to ask Mario Draghi for a competitiveness report. In a way, it's a confession that not sufficiently has been done to complete internal market. We still don't have a capital markets union. We are lagging behind in many areas of the internal market. Is far from complete. It was my commission who started the banking union. It's not yet done. So what was said very wisely, in fact, European Union is not good in execution. Sometimes the design is good, but execution is lagging behind. So we need a real commitment in terms of economic reform, to become more competitive so that we can share the prosperity among our citizens, but also the defense, because what's going on is a global conflict. We are in the middle of a global conflict. It's not just about Ukraine and Russia. Because when we see China politically, we have never seen China and Russia so close as they are now. Except at the beginning, when in fact it was the Communist Party of the Soviet Union that created or helped create the Communist Party of China. But when we see the political alliance between China and Russia, in fact mobilizing the resentment of the so-called global south against us, against our open societies, open democracies, it's a problem. I was in the African Union recently. I spoke with half of the African Union presidents. It's amazing what's going on. But also we need to understand that when we see Iran and North Korea supplying weapons to Russia, when we see fights, in fact, by proxy between Ukraine and Russia in West Africa, it's already a global conflict. And we have to be prepared, because if Putin wins, it will be a tragedy. First of all, for the courageous Ukrainians, but it will be a tragedy for our freedom and democracy and our way of life in Europe, and for the world as well, because it will mean the end of some kind of shape of a liberal order.
Thank you so much, Mr. Barroso, for injecting just a little bit of optimism into the discussion. Ms. Hahn, I saw you pulling faces at the mention of EU bonds, and I saw you nodding in agreement at much else that was just said. Would you like to proceed with your opening statement, please?
Well, I can't help myself. After all, I'm a German liberal. But I would like to pick up on something else that Mr. Barroso said, that the European Union has always been evolving in crisis. And I absolutely do believe that's true. I mean, the European Union has emerged out of the biggest crisis on our continent and has always grown and taking new forms. But I want to say that particularly as a parliamentarian, I'm kind of worried into what way we are developing, because we've seen that many of these responses, and you mentioned, for example, the COVID crisis, it was states coming together. It was member states coming together. It was capitals. It was head of states coming together and then giving some tasks to the European Commission. And that has been an ad hoc situation. It has not been the normal procedures. It has not been involving the institutions. So we need to ask ourselves in what direction is the European Union heading? Because if all the answers are it's going to be the states doing that between each other, that is not my understanding of the direction that I want the European Union to be developing. So certainly we have a problem if we do not find the structures we have satisfying enough or reliable enough to give quick answers and give quick solutions. So there is quite some homework I think we have to do on reforming the European Union in itself to be fit to be a global player. But if we want to talk about Europe on the world stage, I would like to really summarize what we have heard so far is that the conflict of our time is autocracy versus democracy. And that is, we've seen Ukraine, it was mentioned several times, Russia is turning Ukraine into a battlefield since many years. But we particularly also see it in many European countries. We see it also in the US elections. Autocrats are on the rise. And what are we democracies doing? And particularly the European Union. I mean, there's a reason why we're talking about enlargement. There's a reason why we have so many member states and so many people that want to become citizens of the European Union. Because for them, the European Union is a beacon of hope, of freedom, of democracy. And what are we doing to defend democracy in the world? Particularly when we see that the autocrats are standing very closely together. I mean, China, they're sending surveillance software to Iran, which is helping them to identify the unveiled women. Iran is sending drones to Russia. Russia uses that to attack Ukraine. North Korea, for the first time, is having a booming export because they're producing weapons for Russia's war. And what are we Democrats doing? We heard it on the panel before. We're negotiating trade agreements for many years and not managing to get it over the finish line. I mean, under the Barroso Commission, trade had a much better stance. I remember I was one of the very few being on the streets for the TTIP agreement back in the days. And now we're talking about what a shame it is that we're not having a free trade agreement with the US. We have many conversations with many partners, but in the last mandate, we only finished one new trade agreement. I do not think this is enough. And I'm far from saying we can only do trade with other democracies. I think we need to have a realistic approach. But we need to ask ourselves, when we're not even managing to foster new trade agreements with other democratic partners, what are we doing? Seriously, what are we doing? This is also about strengthening our democracies, about economic leadership, about working together, about collaborating together. So particularly when we talk about economics, that is the area where so far the EU still plays a role on the world stage. When we talk about values in the world, about human rights, about democracy, people are not listening to us because we're an amazing military superpower or we're a diplomatic superpower. We so far are still a relevant economic player, but we also heard some remarks on that. We're pretty much on the downfall. I was one of the leading negotiators for the AI Act in the last mandate, and the talks were not about how can we use and embrace this potential? It was rather about, how can we regulate it so we have the least amount of risks? But if we never dare to take any risk, we're also not going to get far. And being a regulatory superpower is not my understanding of how I want the EU to see being a leader on the global world. So I think we need to come back as the EU what makes us strong. This is especially talking about economy. We need to make the turnaround, and I'm saying this particularly as a German with a lot of old industry. We need to be in the next generation of economy. We need to work closer with the world, and we need to defend democracy, because if we want to play a relevant role on the world stage and defend our way of living, our democracy, our freedom and our prosperity, we really need to get our act together, and the next 5 years will be very short term to do so.
Thank you so much. And finally, Mr. Fischer.
Well, I agree to the most what was said before. But my question is, what will be the future? What will be the role of Europe? What will happen with the Europeans in the 21st century? We see America. I think America will continue to be a superpower, whether on isolationist track, which I hope it will not happen, or on, let me say, conventional track, where America acted in a responsible way as a leader of the world. We see dramatic technological changes, where there is a serious threat for Europe, for the EU, that we will be disconnected, we will fall behind. We are even today far behind. This concerns me a lot because modern technology is moving to East Asia and to the west coast of the United States. Europe is playing no role or almost a minor role. I think we are not well positioned in economic terms. Our weakness in growth, as President Barroso mentioned it, is very concerning, especially for the younger generation. And then there is the fact, which I never thought, I'm born in '48, I never thought that I will be confronted with this fact, that war came back to Europe. That a European big power, Russia, thinks that it can revise all the achievements which were done since the end of the Cold War and attack a smaller neighbor. War came back to Europe. Power politics is back. And this is, I think, a dramatic change, a strategic change for our situation as Europeans. What will happen? All these ideas, give the Russians Luhansk, give them Donetsk or whatever. What will happen if Putin wins? Will he stop this policy of aggression? No. It will continue, but more to the west. We must be aware about this fact. Let me tell to the younger part of the audience here, it's now time to open the history books for you, to understand what's going on. And this will change the European Union dramatically. Pressure from the outside. Europe is good and growing in crisis. This is a major historical crisis now, imposed by Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin on us. And if we don't draw the consequences out of this, we will face a very grim future. The consequence must be we must be able to defend ourselves and to deter any aggressor before the aggression starts. This is unavoidable. This is a must. And therefore, the European Union must transform itself into a union which can really defend and deter, together with our allies. The relationship between NATO and EU must be redefined. The European Union, on the one hand, became stronger by the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO. If you would have asked me 1 year ago whether this will happen, I would have said, forget about it. It will never happen. But it happened. And this gave me a sense of optimism. I think the European Union must redefine its relationship with NATO. Only 4 member states, Cyprus, Malta, Ireland, and Austria, unfortunately, are not member of NATO. And all the rest of the EU members are member of NATO now. Now this gives a huge opportunity to redefine the relationship. But we are not only threatened by the Russian aggression. There is another alarming element from inside. And this is a Western challenge. It happens not only in Europe, it happens in the US. In the US, it's the isolationist tradition of the United States. It was traditionally balanced by the strong religiously impacted motivation of the founding of the US. We shouldn't underestimate the idealistic element of the American mentality, of the American psychology. It's extremely strong. But for us, it's nationalism. Nationalism is back. You will see it in France. They are at the brink of being elected into the Élysée next time, if this goes on. You can see it in the Netherlands. You can see it in Austria. Cross my fingers. You can see it in the state elections in East Germany, coming up, state elections. And you can see it wherever you go. Thank God, Poland voted in a different way. And thank God, Portugal and Spain are on a different track. But we shouldn't forget that this is a terrible threat. It's anti-European, it's anti-Western, it's anti-America. And to the antis, they are nationalists, they are pro-Russian. So it's a position which will weaken us. We have a threat from outside and we have a threat from inside. This is a dramatic moment now for the European Union. And if Trump will be elected, what I hope will not happen, but it's only my hope. If Trump will be re-elected, we will wake up at November 6th this year with a war in Ukraine, with Putin's aggression, with instability from the inside by nationalists, and with uncertain alliance with our most important protector. And the EU was grown under the protection of the US, don't forget that. We will be in a very critical situation. But that's exactly what you defined as the moment of growing crisis. This will be one of the biggest crises. So that's the black picture for the future. But there is a positive one. Trump will not be elected. And the Ukrainians and the Ukrainians will not be defeated. And the threat from inside will be pushed back. That's the positive option. And based on my 76 years of experience of life, I guess it will be something in between, in the gray zone. So this offers a huge opportunity. But the biggest problem I see is that we don't have European leaders. Where they are? In France, in Germany, where are the convinced Europeans? And conviction means to risk something for the sake of a better Europe. Where they are? What I hear in my country and in other countries is, oh, well, with Europe you can't lose elections, but you can't win elections. This is the European Union would never existed if this would have been the thinking of the founding fathers and mothers. We must be aware of that. And therefore, it's important to attend congresses like here in Alpbach. But the younger generation must engage. You must engage for Europe. You must fight for Europe. Otherwise, it will be a fading project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Fischer. I hope the answer to your last question is at least some of them are in this room right here. We don't have much time, but I will pass along one question and one topic that seems to come up the most to everyone, actually, which is, it seems that we're all in agreement, both the speakers and everyone in this room, what currently the biggest threat is, which is this divergence that you mentioned between democracy and autocracy. And we have many questions about disinformation, anti-democratic narratives, illiberalism. So one to you, Mr. Barroso, is, do you believe the EU will also survive this crisis of disinformation, this crisis of democracy? And if so, how will we do that?
Yes, I'm absolutely confident the European Union will. I mean, democracy is much stronger than authoritarianism. Sometimes we are afraid of authoritarianism because we tend to exaggerate. It's always, to over-dramatize our problems and to underestimate the problem. Let me tell you once again. It was 50 years ago. I had just turned 18 years. Portugal was the longest authoritarian system in Europe, almost 50 years. Right-wing, ultra, not really fascist, but close to it. In one night, it collapsed like that. I was there, I saw it. They seem very strong, but they can destroy it one night. Soviet Union, the most formidable until now
system of totalitarian organization in the world was the Soviet Union. It collapsed like that. Berlin Wall collapsed. They seem very strong, but they are not strong. Because people, when they have a choice, they will always choose freedom. And even China. I've been going to China for many, many years. I was negotiating with China the handover of Macau since the 80s. I'm going there every year except COVID. Do you believe that those bright young men and young women in Shanghai, the dynamism, they will want forever to be run by a communist party that is 90 million people that direct 1.4 billion? Freedom and democracy, it's much stronger, I tell you. So the point is, of course, not to be naive. And following what Joschka Fischer said, when are we going to be from now? The point is, I believe these problems outside are driving force for our integration. I think that one of the great federators of Europe, I'm not proposing giving him the Charlemagne Prize, but I think he has been one of the great federators, has been Putin. Putin has been encouraging us to be together. And to some extent, I'm afraid to say, Mr. Trump as well. Mr. Trump, to some extent, when he was so aggressive against Europe and did not understand that the United States of America needs allies, what is not the case with Biden or others, is also telling us, you have to put your act together. So in fact, globally, I think now people are understanding in Europe that we need this dimension, we need scale. As a former politician, no longer with us, said, basically, in Europe, all countries are small. The problem is that some have not yet noticed it. I mean, with all respect, Germany is very small. France is very small compared with the United States or compared with China, or even India in demographic terms, or Russia also in military terms. We are very small. The only way, if we want to defend our values, and our interests, because it's not just about values, so it's also about interests, and sometimes we have some trade-offs to make. We have to see. We cannot only trade with democracies. If not, we are going to be isolated in the world. We, of course, have to have a privileged relationship with our democracies, but we cannot only trade with our like-minded countries. But I believe that if we have that dimension of the European integration, I think we are in a position to defend our interests and our values, and above all, the great value of freedom. And to conclude my remarks, I said that when people ask me, how is it going to be 10, 20 years from now? I say, it depends. It's not open, the future is not written. It depends on you, namely on younger people. It depends on what you do. If you are able or not to mobilize the public opinion. Because if we don't believe in democracy, I mean, we should change at least in politics, we should change our business. So, if we believe in democracy, we believe that our arguments have the weight to win the debate. So, and we have to go on, including with social media. We have to be present in that debate and to show that the alternative is even worse. And to conclude, let me tell you, where were we? This is 80th anniversary of this forum, as our chairman just said. Where was Europe? Where was Austria 8 years ago? Where was my own country 50 years ago? Not a democracy, or Spain or Greece. Where are all Central Eastern European countries some years ago? Some of them not even independent, like the Baltic countries occupied by Russia. So are we better now? Are we worse? We are much better than we were before. And if you look at the social indicators, I had that discussion with President Obama, one about Greece. Obama was asking, how is it possible that Greece survives in these conditions? He said, I had to remind him that the life expectancy in Greece is higher than the United States of America. He did not know. And he said, it's Mediterranean diet. He said, but the child mortality is lower. So in fact, in Europe, we don't have the competitiveness, the growth mindset of our American friends, but we have a social market economy that we should be proud of. One of the best places in the world to live is here in Austria. We are in one of the best places in terms of, let's say, relatively equity or low inequality, cultural development. We are, in fact, very privileged. But if you want to keep this, we have to fight for it, and that means, of course, to grow geopolitically, to be able to defend what we stand for.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Barroso. Unfortunately, one of the less amazing aspects of my job is that I constantly have to tell very important people that we don't have any more time left for them to speak or to ask themselves to keep it short, and I'm afraid I have to do that right now. We're out of time, but Alpbach is a very eye-to-eye level place, so I'm sure that you can approach our other speakers as well during their time here and ask your questions in person. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you. Thank you to everyone in the audience as well, and of course also our previous speakers for being with us today. You're all getting ready to go to dinner, I know, so I won't keep you much longer. Thank you so much, and enjoy the next couple of days. Have a wonderful time.